The first few minutes of Home Alone 3 commit an almost unbelievable act of franchise violence. There is no McAllister family racing through an airport. No Kevin waking up to discover an empty house. No Harry and Marv lurking outside a suburban window. Instead, the movie opens on something that sounds less like a Christmas comedy and more like the premise of a 1990s techno-thriller. A military-grade microprocessor, capable of guiding a missile system and worth millions of dollars, is accidentally hidden inside a remote-controlled toy car. And somewhere in Chicago, an 8-year-old boy is about to become the only person standing between that tiny piece of technology and 4 professional criminals who have crossed international borders to recover it. If you entered this movie expecting another Kevin McAllister adventure, the message is immediate. This is not that movie. In fact, the strangest thing about Home Alone May 3rd be that it barely seems interested in pretending that it is. By 1997, Macaulay Culkin was no longer the child actor who could simply walk into a room and turn a franchise into an event. He had stepped away from acting after years of extraordinary pressure, and without him, the central identity of Home Alone had disappeared. For a studio, replacing the most recognizable child star of the decade inside a franchise built almost entirely around his personality was an enormous gamble. For audiences, it could feel almost like being handed a completely different Christmas movie and being told that the title should make it familiar. Yet John Hughes did not attempt to manufacture another Kevin. Instead, he created Alex Pruitt, a child whose greatest weapon is not sarcasm, confidence, or the desire to prove that he can survive alone. Alex is observant, analytical, patient. He watches before he acts. That difference matters because Home Alone 3 quietly changes the fantasy at the center of the series. Kevin wants freedom and discovers that being alone can be exhilarating. Alex is isolated for a completely different reason, and his isolation becomes tactical. Chickenpox keeps him inside while the adults move through the outside world, leaving him physically limited but strangely empowered by technology. His telescope becomes surveillance equipment. His remote-controlled car becomes an extension of his vision. His bedroom becomes a command center. And his house stops being simply a place that needs protecting. It becomes a machine. That is where the movie's most ridiculous idea becomes its most interesting one. What if an 8-year-old did not accidentally stumble into defending his home, but consciously engineered the defense? What if the child at the center of Home Alone was less a mischievous prankster and more a miniature military strategist? The movie answers that question with an escalating series of traps that turn a perfectly ordinary suburban house into a mechanical nightmare. And then there are the villains. They are not 2 petty thieves who want televisions and jewelry. They are trained international criminals chasing stolen technology. Their introduction immediately raises the stakes beyond anything the original movies ever attempted. That creates the central contradiction of Home Alone 3. The film is simultaneously bigger and smaller than its predecessors. The threat is more dangerous, yet the emotional world is less intimate. The criminals are more competent, yet the comedy eventually reduces them to human pinballs. The technology is more advanced, yet the movie's greatest pleasures still come from the simplest possible equation. An intruder walks into a trap, and an 8-year-old has already thought 3 moves ahead. So what exactly happened here? Did Home Alone 3 misunderstand the franchise, or did it accidentally create one of the most inventive pieces of late 90s slapstick that audiences were simply unwilling to accept under the Home Alone name? To answer that, we have to look beyond the childhood disappointment of discovering that Kevin is gone and examine the movie on its own terms. Because Home Alone 3 is not simply the story of a new child defending a house. It is the story of a franchise trying to survive the loss of the person who made it famous. And that makes its history almost as fascinating as its traps. Part 2. Context Background. The easiest way to understand Home Alone 3 is to begin with what it was never supposed to become. After the enormous success of Home Alone and Home Alone 2, Lost in New York, the obvious Hollywood instinct would have been to keep Macaulay Culkin at the center and build another increasingly extravagant adventure around him. The first movie had transformed an ordinary suburban Christmas into a fantasy of childhood independence. The second took that fantasy and moved it into Manhattan. The natural progression was to make Kevin older, more capable, and perhaps more sarcastic. There was even discussion of continuing the character into his teenage years, allowing the franchise to grow alongside its young star. But reality intervened. Culkin's relationship with acting had become increasingly complicated, and by the middle of the 1990s he had stepped away from the profession. The studio was left with a familiar problem. The franchise still had value, but the face of the franchise was no longer available. That created an almost impossible creative choice. Cancel the series and preserve its reputation, or replace the central character and risk discovering that audiences were attached not to the concept of Home Alone, but to Kevin himself. John Hughes chose the dangerous option. Rather than inventing another McAllister adventure without Macaulay Culkin, Hughes rebuilt the story around a new child. Alex Pruitt was younger, physically isolated, technologically curious, and more analytical. The premise remained recognizable enough to carry the title, but the emotional architecture changed. Instead of repeating Kevin's personality, the movie asked what another child might do with the same basic fantasy. That decision also reflected a broader shift in 1990s family entertainment. Technology was becoming increasingly visible in children's lives. Remote-controlled toys, home computers, video cameras, pagers, electronic security systems, and increasingly sophisticated consumer gadgets were becoming symbols of a world moving rapidly toward the digital age. Home Alone 3 uses that fascination almost obsessively. Alex's intelligence is expressed through machines. He does not need to physically run everywhere because he can send a toy car where he cannot go. He does not simply look through a window, he observes through a telescope. He does not merely remember what he has seen, he records it. Even the villains belong to this new technological landscape. Their target is not cash sitting in a safe. It is information encoded into a tiny piece of advanced hardware. The movie therefore replaces the simple economics of burglary with the paranoia of corporate and military espionage. That change is crucial because it explains why Home Alone 3 feels so different even when it is following the same basic formula. The first film asks what happens when criminals underestimate a child. The third asks what happens when professionals underestimate a child. Rya Kihlstedt was also uniquely positioned to handle that transformation. Before directing the third installment, he had worked as an editor on the first two Home Alone films. Editing is an unusual background for a slapstick director because comedy often depends on rhythm more than dialogue. A fall is not funny simply because someone falls. It is funny because the audience sees the setup, anticipates the impact, receives the impact, and then gets just enough time to process the absurdity before the next beat arrives. Kihlstedt understood that rhythm from inside the franchise. That experience would become one of Home Alone 3's quiet strengths. Whatever the movie loses in emotional continuity, it retains an unusually strong understanding of how to construct a physical comedy sequence. The timing of the release made the challenge even harder. Home Alone 3 arrived in the crowded holiday marketplace of 1997, a period dominated by enormous cinematic events. Titanic was becoming the defining cultural phenomenon of the season, while Tomorrow Never Dies represented the continuing power of the James Bond franchise. Home Alone was no longer the only major holiday brand in the room. And audiences had changed. The original Home Alone had become a cultural landmark. Home Alone 2 had expanded the formula while keeping the same cast, director, musical identity, and emotional continuity. By comparison, the third movie asked viewers to accept a new child, a new family, new criminals, a different tone, and a substantially different kind of threat. The marketing therefore had to sell the novelty. Instead of promising another Kevin adventure, it emphasized gadgets, elaborate traps, and a group of dangerous criminals. The film was effectively saying, "You may not know this kid, but you know what happens when a kid is left alone." Financially, the result was respectable but nowhere near the phenomenon of the first two films. Against a production budget in the low 30s of millions, the movie earned roughly $30 million domestically and around $49 million internationally. Those numbers did not represent disaster, but they revealed something important. Home Alone had made hundreds of millions worldwide. Home Alone 2 had done the same. The third movie could survive, but it could not reproduce the cultural explosion. And that distinction would follow it for decades. Because the question was never simply whether Home Alone 3 made money. The question was whether audiences believed it deserved to exist. Part 3, Story Recap. The movie begins far away from the suburban house where most of its story will unfold. At San Francisco International Airport, a group of highly trained criminals are attempting to transport a tiny piece of technology without attracting attention. Their target is a valuable microprocessor connected to missile guidance technology, small enough to disappear inside an ordinary object and important enough to justify an international operation. Peter Beaupre leads the group, accompanied by Alice Ribbons, Burton Jernigan, and Earl Unger. Unlike Harry and Marv, these people are not neighborhood burglars improvising a robbery. They are professionals. And yet the entire operation collapses because of something almost embarrassingly ordinary, a mix-up involving luggage and a toy remote-controlled car. The microchip ends up concealed inside a toy. Through a chain of mistaken identities and exchanged bags, that toy eventually finds its way into the hands of Mrs. Hess, an elderly neighbor in Chicago. She has no idea that the object she has acquired is worth millions of dollars. To her, it is simply something that belongs to someone else. That is the joke at the center of the movie's premise. An object capable of triggering an international manhunt has become indistinguishable from the clutter of suburban childhood. The toy eventually reaches Alex Pruitt. Alex is 8 years old and temporarily trapped inside his house because he has chickenpox. That illness is more important to the structure of the movie than it initially appears. In the original Home Alone, Kevin's isolation is created by a family mistake. Here, Alex's isolation is physical. He cannot simply leave the house and explore. He cannot join the other children outside. His world contracts to bedrooms, windows, hallways, technology, and imagination. The remote-controlled car becomes his connection to everything beyond the bedroom walls. Alex receives it after doing a small chore for Mrs. Hess, and the object seems completely innocent. He plays with it because that is what an 8-year-old does with a remote-controlled toy. But the movie quickly turns the toy into something more sophisticated. Alex begins using it to explore spaces he cannot easily reach. He attaches a camera to it and discovers that the vehicle can function almost like a tiny surveillance drone. Meanwhile, the 4 criminals are searching for the missing microchip. They move through the neighborhood methodically. Houses are examined. People are questioned. Vehicles are watched. Their behavior creates an unsettling contrast with the peaceful suburban environment. Snow covers the streets. Families continue their routines. Christmas decorations remain visible. Yet underneath that ordinary surface, a professional search operation is unfolding. Alex notices. At first, he does exactly what a child should do. He tells adults. But the problem is that Alex has already developed a reputation for causing false alarms. His previous warnings are not taken seriously. The more he tries to explain what he has seen, the more the adults interpret his behavior as imagination or mischief. This is one of the movie's most important structural ideas. Alex is not merely alone physically. He is alone epistemologically. He knows something that the adults do not know, but because he is a child, his knowledge has no institutional authority. The more accurate he becomes, the less believable he appears. He calls the police. He tries to explain that suspicious people are moving through the neighborhood. But from the outside, his story sounds absurd. For international criminals hunting a toy car? A child with chickenpox monitoring strangers through a telescope? It is easier for adults to believe that Alex is exaggerating than to accept that their quiet neighborhood has become the center of an international operation. So Alex watches. Through his telescope, he begins identifying patterns. The criminals are not wandering randomly. They are searching. Their movements connect. Their attention keeps returning to houses where they believe the missing object may be hidden. The telescope transforms the familiar suburban landscape. Windows become observation posts. Snow-covered streets become corridors. Neighbors become variables. The distance between Alex and the outside world becomes both a weakness and an advantage. He can see them without being seen. Eventually, Alex uses the remote-controlled car to gather evidence. The small vehicle moves through spaces where a child cannot safely go, carrying a camera that captures images of the intruders. For a brief moment, Alex's childish toy becomes an investigative tool. This is where the movie begins transforming its central character. Kevin McAllister discovered his ability to fight back after being forced into a crisis. Alex is discovering that he can gather information before the crisis arrives. That difference changes everything. The criminals eventually realize that the missing microchip has ended up inside Alex's remote-controlled car. Their search suddenly has a destination. The Pruitt house. At first, Alex's home still looks like an ordinary family residence. There is nothing obviously fortified about it. There are no security guards, no weapons, no sophisticated defense systems. There is only an 8-year-old boy who has been dismissed repeatedly and who now understands that the adults will not arrive in time. That realization is the emotional hinge of the story. Alex cannot make the criminals disappear. He cannot overpower them physically. He cannot persuade the authorities to act. What he can do is prepare. And preparation is where his intelligence becomes dangerous. He studies the house. He considers entrances and exits. He examines the environment around the property. He thinks about what can be moved, triggered, electrified, frozen, launched, or redirected. The house becomes a puzzle. Every ordinary object suddenly has a second purpose. A piece of equipment can become a trap. A household surface can become a weapon. A toy can become surveillance. A pet can become an accomplice. The logic is exaggerated, but it is also strangely consistent with the film's central fantasy. If adults have authority because they possess resources, a child can compensate by using those resources more creatively. The criminals, meanwhile, become increasingly certain that they are closing in. They tap communications and narrow their search. Their professional behavior initially makes them intimidating. They are not clueless. They analyze the situation. They understand that the child may be involved. They divide responsibilities and approach the problem with the confidence of people accustomed to controlling environments. That confidence becomes their weakness. They assume the house is a location. Alex knows it is a system. This distinction is what allows the second half of the movie to work. The criminals enter expecting a conventional residence. Alex has redesigned it psychologically, even if he has not physically rebuilt every wall. He knows where they will go. He understands what they are likely to touch. He anticipates the movement of people who do not realize they are already participating in his plan. The invasion begins. Four criminals approach from different directions, turning the Pruitt property into a coordinated assault zone. The sequence has more in common with a miniature action movie than the domestic burglary setup of the original. There are multiple attackers. Their objectives are clear. They believe they have the advantage. Alex is alone. But alone is no longer the same thing as helpless. In the basement and throughout the house, he has prepared his defenses. Mechanical triggers are positioned. Household objects have been repurposed. The environment itself is waiting to respond. Even the animals around him become part of the absurd defensive ecosystem. The film understands something fundamental about slapstick. Preparation is often funnier than impact. The audience enjoys knowing that something terrible is about to happen before the character does. We see the trap. We see the villain approach. We understand the inevitable collision. And then the movie waits. That anticipation is the true engine of the climax. One criminal encounters an electrical trap and receives an exaggerated jolt. Another becomes trapped in an environment of ice and freezing water. Lawn equipment becomes unexpectedly dangerous. A trampoline becomes a launch mechanism. Surfaces that should be harmless suddenly become hostile. The violence is cartoonish, but the physical commitment is real enough to make the sequence feel substantial. The criminals fall, crash, slide, bounce, and collide with the environment in ways that would be horrifying if presented realistically. The movie survives the brutality by turning every impact into a visual punchline. The more professional the criminals appeared at the beginning, the more ridiculous their destruction becomes. That reversal is the point. They entered the story with the authority of international operatives. They leave it as victims of household engineering. And Alex never needs to become physically stronger than them. He simply becomes smarter than their expectations. By the time the authorities arrive, the impossible has already happened. The child who could not convince anyone that danger existed has neutralized the danger himself. The criminals are captured, the missing technology is recovered, and Alex's family is finally forced to confront the fact that the warnings they dismissed were true. The resolution follows the traditional Home Alone pattern. The house survives. The family reunites. The child is vindicated. But there is a subtle difference. Kevin's victory was partly about proving that he could survive without adults. Alex's victory is about proving that adults should have listened to him. That distinction gives Home Alone 3 its own emotional identity, even if it never reaches the warmth of the original. Part 4. Character Analysis. Alex Pruitt is perhaps the most misunderstood element of Home Alone 3 because he is often judged according to a character he was never designed to replace. Kevin McAllister is charismatic because he is emotionally expressive. He complains. He jokes. He gets angry. He celebrates. His personality drives the original movies. Alex is quieter. His defining characteristic is attention. He watches. He remembers. He calculates. Where Kevin turns isolation into freedom, Alex turns isolation into observation. His motivation is therefore less selfish than Kevin's. Kevin initially wants to be left alone. Alex does not. He is stuck at home because he is sick, and his isolation becomes something imposed upon him. The danger arrives from outside, and his decision to fight back is primarily defensive. He is not proving that he does not need his family. He is trying to protect the house while the people who should protect him are elsewhere. That makes Alex's intelligence feel almost compensatory. His physical limitation becomes the reason he thinks differently. He cannot chase the criminals. So he observes them. He cannot confront them directly. So he uses the RC car. He cannot rely on adults. So he creates evidence. He cannot overpower 4 adults. So he manipulates the environment. The film therefore turns disability, illness, or simple physical restriction into a storytelling mechanism for technological creativity. Alex's body limits his movement, but his imagination expands the battlefield. Alex D. Linz's performance supports this approach by avoiding the exaggerated sass that could easily have turned the character into a Kevin imitation. He plays Alex with earnestness. Even when the situation becomes absurd, the boy often behaves as though he is genuinely trying to solve a serious problem. That seriousness is essential. If Alex laughed constantly at his own traps, the movie would lose the feeling that he is improvising under pressure. His sincerity gives the slapstick a strange emotional grounding. He believes the danger is real. Therefore, when the criminals suffer increasingly ridiculous consequences, the audience can enjoy the comedy without feeling that Alex is simply being cruel. The villains create an equally important contrast. Peter Beaupre is not Harry. He does not have Harry's theatrical stupidity or Marv's manic impulsiveness. Beaupre is controlled, quiet, and professional. His danger comes from restraint. He looks like someone who has done this before. Alice Ribbons adds another dimension. As a major female member of the criminal team, she is not simply there to repeat a Harry and Marv dynamic with a different costume. She participates in the operation as a capable professional. The criminals are presented as a team, not a pair of comic personalities. That competence creates an unusual tonal problem. If the villains are genuinely dangerous, then watching an 8-year-old destroy them becomes disturbing. If they are obviously incompetent, then Alex's intelligence means less. The movie solves the problem by changing them gradually. Early scenes establish them as credible threats. The climax transforms that credibility into slapstick. They begin as international operatives and end as bodies moving through a cartoon machine. This transformation is funny precisely because the audience remembers how serious they were. The supporting cast completes the strange social world around Alex. Molly, played by Scarlett Johansson in one of her early screen roles, represents the familiar late 90s teenage sibling attitude. She is not the emotional center of the story, but her dismissiveness contributes to Alex's isolation. Like many children in family comedies, Alex exists inside a hierarchy where older siblings automatically assume they understand more than he does. That makes his eventual vindication satisfying. The same pattern appears with Mrs. Hess. At first, she is the stereotypical grumpy neighbor. She seems hostile, suspicious, and disconnected from Alex's world. But the story eventually places her in danger, forcing the film to soften the boundaries between the child and the adult world. She becomes evidence that appearances are not always reliable. Then there is the parrot. The talking bird is one of the film's stranger inventions, but its narrative purpose is surprisingly practical. The animal can repeat information, create comic interruptions, and provide exposition without requiring Alex to speak every piece of information aloud. In a film centered on surveillance and communication, the parrot becomes another form of information transfer. The animals therefore belong to the same technological fantasy as the RC car. They are not simply cute additions. They are tools in a child's world. And that is ultimately what makes the Pruitt family dynamic work, despite its emotional thinness. Alex lives in a world where adults possess physical authority, older siblings possess social authority, and institutions possess legal authority. He possesses none of those things. What he possesses is attention. And Home Alone 3 repeatedly suggests that attention can become its own form of power. Part 5, Themes Symbolism. At its heart, Home Alone 3 is a story about adults refusing to believe children until the evidence becomes impossible to ignore. Alex sees something dangerous and tells people. They dismiss him. He tries again. They still doubt him. His problem is not that he lacks information. His problem is that he lacks credibility. That is a very familiar childhood experience. Children often notice things adults overlook because they are positioned differently inside the world. They hear conversations that adults assume they do not understand. They observe patterns that seem insignificant to grown-ups. They notice strangers, routines, changes, and inconsistencies. The movie exaggerates this reality into a fantasy in which the child's observations are literally correct. But the theme becomes more interesting because Alex's advantage is not innocence. It is technology. The RC car is the clearest symbol of that transformation. At first, it is simply a toy. But once Alex attaches a camera, it becomes an extension of his eyes. He cannot physically enter every space, but the machine can. The boundary between seeing and acting begins to disappear. That reflects a larger late 90s cultural fascination with technology. The internet was entering ordinary homes. Computers were becoming personal rather than purely institutional. Video cameras were increasingly accessible. Electronic toys were becoming more sophisticated. Home Alone 3 imagines the child not as the victim of technological change, but as its master. The adults have authority. Alex has tools. And because he knows how to use those tools, the balance shifts. The suburban house is equally important. In the first Home Alone, the house is a symbol of family comfort transformed into a battlefield. Here, it becomes something closer to a fortress. The outside world is cold, hostile, and technologically threatening. The interior is warm, cluttered, familiar, and filled with objects whose purposes Alex can reinterpret. The visual contrast reinforces this. The villains move through a world of snow, gray streets, surveillance, and uncertainty. Inside the Pruitt residence, warm colors and Christmas decorations create a protective atmosphere. The house is not merely shelter. It is identity. The Christmas imagery is therefore doing double duty. It establishes tradition while also emphasizing what has changed. The original Home Alone films use Christmas as an emotional force. Their stories are about family separation and reunion. The holiday gives the characters something to return to. Home Alone 3 uses Christmas more as atmosphere. Snow makes the traps possible. Holiday decorations make the house visually recognizable. The season creates a cozy backdrop for the violence. That difference explains why the movie can feel like a Home Alone film without always feeling like a Christmas movie. Its deeper anxiety belongs to the technological age. The villains are not interested in Alex's family's possessions. They are interested in a tiny piece of advanced hardware. The value of the object has nothing to do with its physical size. Information and technology have become commodities. That shift reflects the changing nature of villainy in family entertainment. Harry and Marv want things ordinary people understand. These criminals want something ordinary people barely understand at all. That makes them more abstract. The original villains are funny because their motivations are mundane. The third movie's villains are funny because their motivations are disproportionately serious. They are chasing a piece of technology that has been elevated into a geopolitical object, and the entire operation eventually collapses because an 8-year-old has turned a suburban home into a Rube Goldberg machine. There is something almost prophetic about that absurdity. The film was released before the security culture that would define the post-9/11 world. Airports were already spaces associated with surveillance and control, but the movie treats them as the beginning of a comic espionage plot rather than the center of a larger cultural fear. Its villains are remnants of a Cold War imagination filtered through 1990s corporate technology. Secret information. International operatives. Military hardware. Electronic surveillance. Suburban America. The collision between those elements creates a strange snapshot of its era. Even the parents' absence carries cultural meaning. They are not simply irresponsible. They are working adults in a household where children are expected to function within a complicated schedule. The movie does not deeply explore the pressures of dual-income family life, but the background is there. The house is full of people, yet Alex remains emotionally and physically isolated. The contradiction is revealing. Modern suburban life is supposed to provide safety through infrastructure, communication, and family systems. But when those systems fail, the child is left with the responsibility. Home Alone 3 turns that fear into fantasy. The message is not that adults are useless. It is that adults are not always present when children need them. And when that happens, resourcefulness becomes survival. Part 6. Production Breakdown. The physical comedy of Home Alone 3 depends on an important illusion. Everything looks dangerously real while remaining carefully controlled. That is the foundation of practical slapstick. The audience has to believe that the villains have suffered a catastrophic accident without actually seeing real catastrophic consequences. A person falls. A machine strikes them. A surface gives way. An electrical shock sends them flying. The body reacts in an exaggerated way that communicates pain without requiring realistic injury. That balance demands precise stunt work. The movie belongs to a period when practical effects still dominated family slapstick. CGI could assist certain shots, but the physical world remained the primary playground. Mechanical rigs, stunt performers, breakaway materials, controlled falls, padded surfaces, and carefully designed camera angles created the illusion of chaos. The trap sequences are essentially mechanical choreography. Every device has to work. Every performer has to know where the impact is coming from. Every camera needs to be positioned so that the audience understands what happened. And the edit has to preserve the joke. This is where Rya Kihlstedt's background becomes particularly relevant. Having edited the first two Home Alone films, he understood that the comedy was not simply in the stunt. It was in the sequence surrounding the stunt. The setup creates expectation. The camera reveals the trap. The villain enters. There is a pause. Then impact. Then reaction. Then another beat. Then escalation. That rhythm is almost musical. The physical world becomes an instrument. A lawnmower is no longer just a lawnmower. A frozen pool is no longer just a frozen pool. A trampoline becomes a launch pad. An electrical line becomes a comic detonator. The objects are funny because the audience understands their normal purpose before seeing them transformed. This is one of the major strengths of the film's production design. It does not require fantastical weapons. It takes ordinary suburban objects and changes their function. That is exactly what the Home Alone concept has always done. The third movie simply does it on a more elaborate scale. Animal performers create another technical complication. The parrot has to function as both a believable animal and a comic performer. Timing animal behavior against human dialogue is inherently unpredictable, which makes the scenes feel slightly more spontaneous than the mechanical trap sequences. The film also uses visual editing to maintain a sense of momentum. The audience is rarely allowed to stare at an effect long enough to question its construction. Cuts hide preparation and recovery. Reaction shots sell impacts. Wide shots establish spatial relationships. Close-ups emphasize expressions. The camera also frequently adopts Alex's perspective. This is important because an 8-year-old's world should look different from an adult's. Adults become larger. Doors become imposing. Hallways become longer. The house becomes a maze. By placing the camera low and allowing adult figures to dominate the frame, the film occasionally recreates the physical vulnerability that defines childhood. But Alex's intelligence reverses that visual hierarchy. The criminals may be bigger. They may be stronger. They may be more experienced. Yet the camera repeatedly shows that Alex understands the environment better. That is why the traps work. The production is effectively turning geography into character. The house has memory. It has pathways. It has blind spots. It has surfaces. It has objects. Once Alex understands those elements, the house becomes an extension of his mind. The harsh winter setting adds another practical layer. Snow changes how characters move, affects visibility, creates slippery surfaces, and alters the visual texture of the film. Winter also gives the production a natural contrast between exterior vulnerability and interior warmth. The resulting visual language is unmistakably late 1990s. Everything feels tangible. The snow feels physical. The machinery feels mechanical. The traps feel built. And the slapstick feels rooted in the material world rather than generated entirely through digital manipulation. That matters because practical comedy has a particular texture. When something real moves through a real space, even an exaggerated stunt carries weight. The audience can feel the momentum. That weight is part of the reason the best traps remain memorable. They are not merely ideas. They are physical events. Part 7, Music Sound. The musical identity of Home Alone may third be one of the clearest signals that the franchise has changed. The first two films are inseparable from John Williams' orchestral language. Their music gives childhood a sense of wonder. Bells, strings, choir, sweeping melodies, and Christmas harmonies transform ordinary spaces into places of emotional significance. Home Alone 3 moves in another direction. Nick Glennie-Smith's score emphasizes action and suspense. The music feels more connected to the movie's espionage premise. Electronic textures and rhythmic propulsion give the film a more modern, kinetic atmosphere. That shift makes sense. The first movies are fantasies about family. The third is a fantasy about surveillance and defense. The score therefore has to communicate a different kind of danger. Instead of asking the audience to feel the magic of Christmas, it frequently asks them to anticipate an attack. This becomes particularly effective during Alex's surveillance sequences. When he looks through the telescope or sends the RC car into spaces he cannot enter, the music helps transform childish curiosity into something resembling intelligence work. A toy becomes equipment. A bedroom becomes headquarters. And the soundtrack follows the transformation. The absence of the emotional weight associated with Somewhere in My Memory is significant. That melody functions almost like an emotional signature for the original films. It tells the audience that beneath the jokes, the story is about family. Without that musical anchor, Home Alone 3 has less emotional glue. It can be energetic. It can be funny. It can be suspenseful. But it rarely reaches the same sentimental register. That is both a weakness and an honest reflection of the movie's identity. The sound design follows the same philosophy. Slapstick depends heavily on sound because physical impacts are often exaggerated beyond realism. A body falling onto a surface needs a sound that communicates weight. A collision needs a metallic clang. A shock needs an electrical burst. A mechanical trap needs a combination of gears, clicks, motors, and sudden movement. The result is a sonic world where reality is deliberately amplified. The villains do not simply fall. They crash. They do not simply hit something. They collide with it. The audience hears the joke before the brain finishes processing the visual. That is classic cartoon logic translated into live action. The soundtrack also places the movie firmly within its decade. Contemporary 1990s songs and pop rock influences coexist with the score, giving the film the texture of the era in which it was made. For modern viewers, those sounds can be almost as nostalgic as the technology visible on screen. A dial tone. A modem. A pager. The mechanical whir of a remote-controlled toy. These noises belong to a world before smartphones erased the boundaries between communication, entertainment, and surveillance. The surveillance sequences are particularly interesting because sound often carries information before the image does. In darker scenes, the audience may hear movement, machinery, or communication before fully understanding what is happening. That creates suspense without requiring constant visual explanation. And then the traps arrive. When the climax begins, sound becomes percussion. Impact. Reaction. Silence. Impact again. The rhythm accelerates. The score pushes forward. The effects become louder. The criminals lose control. Alex gains it. The entire soundtrack therefore mirrors the movie's power reversal. At the beginning, the villains control the music. By the climax, the house does. Part 8, Cultural Impact. The first challenge Home Alone 3 faced was not quality. It was identity. Audiences had spent years associating the title Home Alone with Macaulay Culkin. His face was part of the brand. His voice was part of the rhythm. His personality was part of the comedy. Removing him was therefore not a normal recasting decision. It was a cultural substitution. That explains why the reaction could be harsher than the film itself deserved. Some critics were surprisingly receptive because they evaluated the movie according to what it was doing rather than what audiences wanted it to be. Roger Ebert, for example, gave the film a positive review and regarded it favorably compared with the earlier entries, emphasizing the efficiency of its comedy and structure. That response reveals an important divide. A critic can watch a sequel and ask, "Does this work?" A fan may ask a different question. Is this the movie I wanted? Those are not the same question. Home Alone 3 could succeed at the first and fail at the second. For critics, the traps were coherent. The pacing was efficient. The movie understood its physical comedy mechanics. Alex was a capable protagonist. The story had a clear escalation. For fans, the absence of Kevin could make those strengths irrelevant. It did not matter that Alex was competent if the audience had not emotionally invested in him. It did not matter that the criminals were more sophisticated if the emotional chemistry of Harry and Marv was gone. And it did not matter that the new score created its own identity if viewers were waiting for the familiar musical language of the first two films. The movie also arrived at a time when internet culture was beginning to change the way fans reacted to media. Online newsgroups and early forums provided spaces where viewers could debate sequels, casting decisions, and franchise direction in ways that had previously been limited to magazines, television, and word of mouth. The rejection therefore became part of the film's reputation. The movie was not simply judged. It was compared. And comparison was almost impossible to win. Its later life was different. Holiday television broadcasts gave Home Alone 3 repeated opportunities to find viewers who had no emotional investment in the original theatrical disappointment. Children encountering the movie years later could simply experience it as a story about a clever kid and a group of ridiculous criminals. That audience was more forgiving. The film also became part of the larger ecosystem of franchise sequels that continued after the original stars were gone. Home Alone 4 eventually followed with a television-oriented continuation, and later installments pushed the series even further away from the original identity. In that sense, Home Alone 3 became a prototype for what happens when a studio treats a successful family property as an expandable label. The brand survives. The emotional continuity does not. Yet the movie has also acquired a strange secondary reputation through modern nostalgia. Viewers who grew up with it remember details that were never important to critics at the time. The technology, the snow, the house, the traps, the absurd villains, and, increasingly, the early appearance of Scarlett Johansson. Her presence has become one of the film's most frequently mentioned pieces of trivia, giving the movie a connection to a much larger Hollywood career that audiences could not possibly have predicted in 1997. That is how forgotten movies survive. Not necessarily through prestige. Through memory. Part 9. Critical analysis. The divide between critics and audiences becomes easier to understand when Home Alone 3 is separated into 2 films. The first is a standalone late 90s family comedy. The second is the third chapter of a beloved Christmas franchise. As a standalone comedy, the movie is surprisingly functional. Its premise is clear. Its protagonist has a specific skill set. Its villains have a defined objective. The escalation is logical within the movie's cartoon reality. And the traps are progressively more elaborate. There is very little narrative confusion about what Alex wants or what the criminals want. The problem is that audiences did not buy a ticket to see a standalone movie called something else. They bought a ticket expecting Home Alone. And Home Alone had become more than a premise. It had become a feeling. Chris Columbus' direction in the first 2 films gave the series a distinctive warmth. John Williams' music amplified that warmth. Culkin's performance connected mischievous comedy to genuine vulnerability. The result was a combination that could not simply be reconstructed with another child. Home Alone 3 reproduces the architecture but not the emotional chemistry. That is why the film often works better when viewers stop asking it to be Home Alone. Its greatest weakness is its title. That sounds unfair, but it is also the central truth of the movie. Without the brand expectation, Alex's story is a perfectly competent piece of 1990s slapstick. With the brand attached, every missing element becomes more obvious. Where is Kevin? Where is the emotional family story? Where is the Christmas magic? Where is the musical identity? Where are the 2 incompetent burglars whose relationship carried half the comedy? The movie cannot answer those questions because it is trying to answer different ones. And then there is the violence. Home Alone has always relied on cartoon violence, but Home Alone 3 pushes the premise toward international criminality. The villains are not simply stealing televisions. They are involved in a serious black market operation involving military technology. That creates a tonal dissonance. The movie asks us to believe that these people are dangerous enough to justify an international operation and then asks us to laugh when an 8-year-old subjects them to increasingly brutal household accidents. The original films had the same fundamental problem, but their criminals were so ridiculous that the violence felt more like fantasy from the beginning. Here, the movie spends time establishing competence. That makes the eventual slapstick more extreme. There are also obvious logic problems. Why would professionals repeatedly enter the house under circumstances that make them vulnerable? Why do they continue underestimating Alex? Why does the operation become so elaborate when more direct methods would theoretically be available? These questions are fatal if the movie is judged as realistic crime fiction. They are less important if it is judged as live action. Cartoon logic. And that is where the film asks the viewer for a specific kind of agreement. Do not take the criminals seriously enough to demand realism. But take them seriously enough to make Alex's victory satisfying. That is a difficult balance. The movie occasionally succeeds. Sometimes it does not. The parrot is another example. Its comic usefulness is undeniable, but repeated animal jokes can feel like the script reaching for easy laughs. The talking bird provides exposition and personality, yet its presence can also remind viewers that the movie is trying very hard to maintain the family comedy atmosphere after removing the emotional core that once made the franchise feel effortless. Ultimately, the fairest criticism is not that Home Alone 3 is bad. It is that Home Alone 3 is a better movie than its reputation suggests and a weaker Home Alone movie than its title promises. Those two statements can exist at the same time. Part 10. Industry impact. The financial story of Home Alone 3 is a lesson in diminishing franchise returns. The movie cost roughly $32 million to produce and earned around $30 million domestically, with international markets adding roughly $49 million. That means the worldwide theatrical gross approached the low $80 million range. A respectable result for many family films, but a dramatic fall from the extraordinary numbers generated by the first two installments. Home Alone had become a global phenomenon, earning roughly $476 million worldwide. Home Alone 2 followed with approximately $358 million. Against numbers like those, Home Alone 3 looked less like a continuation of a blockbuster franchise and more like the beginning of a decline. Yet theatrical revenue was only part of the equation. The late 1990s still belonged to physical home media. VHS rentals and sales could extend the commercial life of a movie long after its theatrical run ended. Family films were particularly valuable in this environment because parents could purchase or rent them repeatedly, and children did not necessarily care whether a movie had been a theatrical sensation. This helped films like Home Alone 3 survive. But the studio learned a different lesson from the numbers. The brand had value. The original formula did not necessarily require the original cast. That realization would eventually lead to a new kind of franchise economics. Instead of treating every sequel as a major theatrical event, studios could treat established family properties as recognizable intellectual property. A title could sell a television movie. It could support a home video release. It could appear in holiday programming. It could exist because audiences knew the name even if they no longer expected the same characters. Home Alone 3 sits directly on that transition. It was still theatrical. It still had a substantial budget. It still attempted to preserve the spectacle of the earlier movies. But its commercial performance demonstrated the danger of separating a franchise from the specific combination of actors, filmmakers, music, and emotional identity that created its success. The industry eventually learned to make that separation more aggressively. Home Alone would continue, but its theatrical life had effectively ended. The next major live-action theatrical return would not arrive until decades later. That gap says everything. The studio could keep the name alive. It could not recreate the original cultural moment. There was also a broader lesson for family entertainment. Live-action children's franchises depend heavily on casting. A child actor is not simply a performer in this genre. The actor can become the emotional center of the property itself. Macaulay Culkin was Home Alone. Replacing him did not merely require finding another talented child. It required creating another cultural phenomenon. That is much harder. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, animation was increasingly becoming the safer environment for family franchises because characters could remain visually consistent while performers changed, and stories could expand without the same aging problem that affects child actors. Home Alone 3 therefore belongs to an important transitional moment. It arrived just before Hollywood fully understood how valuable long-term animated franchises could become. And its limitations helped demonstrate why live-action family brands were so fragile. Part 11: Legacy. Home Alone 3 occupies a peculiar place in the history of John Hughes. It does not represent the peak of his career. It does not carry the cultural weight of The Breakfast Club, Ferris Bueller's Day Off, Planes, Trains and Automobiles, or the original Home Alone. But it belongs to the final period in which Hughes was still actively shaping mainstream youth and family entertainment. That alone gives the film historical significance. Hughes had spent years understanding children as characters with real emotional lives rather than simply miniature adults. Even when his stories were exaggerated, children often possessed a perspective that adults ignored. Alex fits that tradition. He is underestimated. He is observant. He is capable. And his eventual victory comes from trusting what he knows. The film also represents the end of an era in physical comedy. By the late 1990s, digital effects were rapidly changing the possibilities of filmmaking. Computer-generated imagery was becoming increasingly sophisticated, and action comedy filmmakers had more ways to create impossible movement without building every effect physically. Home Alone 3 still belongs to the older tradition. The traps are designed around real objects. The performances depend on physical choreography. The comedy depends on bodies moving through space. That makes the movie feel surprisingly tangible today. Its dated technology is another source of fascination. Pagers, dial-up connections, old computers, remote-controlled toys, late 90s clothing. These details were invisible to audiences in 1997 because they were simply contemporary life. Now they function as historical markers. The technology that once made Alex look futuristic can make the movie look almost quaint. A remote-controlled car carrying a camera once seemed clever. Today, a child carrying a smartphone has more surveillance capability in their pocket than Alex could have imagined. That contrast changes the meaning of the story. Yet the practical traps have aged better. The reason is simple. Physics does not become obsolete. A person slipping on ice still makes sense. A body reacting to an electrical shock still communicates physical comedy. A mechanical device misfiring still has visual immediacy. The technology dates the movie. The slapstick preserves it. That is why annual Christmas marathons can rescue films that critics once dismissed. A movie seen once in a theater in 1997 is being judged differently from a movie discovered on television by a child in 2004, then remembered by an adult in 2015, then revisited through an online video essay in 2026. Nostalgia changes the frame. But nostalgia should not erase criticism. Home Alone 3 is not secretly a masterpiece simply because people remember watching it during childhood. Its flaws remain. Its emotional center is weaker. Its villain premise is excessive. Its connection to the original franchise is mostly structural. Its Christmas atmosphere rarely reaches the emotional depth of the first two films. But those weaknesses can coexist with genuine craftsmanship. The traps are inventive. The pacing is controlled. Alex is a coherent protagonist. The movie has a clear visual identity. And its commitment to practical comedy gives it a physical energy that many modern family comedies struggle to reproduce. That makes Home Alone 3 neither a forgotten classic nor a worthless sequel. It is something more interesting. A time capsule that happens to be funny. Part 12, Final Reflection. So where should Home Alone 3 actually sit in the Home Alone hierarchy? Probably not at the bottom simply because it lacks Kevin. And probably not near the top simply because nostalgia has softened its reputation. The fairest judgment is somewhere in between. As a piece of 1990s slapstick, it is much stronger than its reputation suggests. The practical stunt work gives the climax genuine physical energy. Alex D. Linz plays the character with an earnest intelligence that prevents him from becoming a cheap imitation of Macaulay Culkin. The traps are imaginative, varied, and carefully structured. Rya Kihlstedt's understanding of editing rhythm helps the comedy land. But as a continuation of the original emotional experience, the movie falls short. The family lacks the same warmth. The Christmas atmosphere feels more decorative than thematic. The villains are more dangerous in concept but less memorable as personalities. And the absence of Kevin creates a gap that no amount of technology can fill. That is the paradox. Home Alone 3 was probably doomed the moment audiences decided that Home Alone meant Macaulay Culkin. The movie could only lose that argument. Yet perhaps that is exactly why it deserves another look. Strip away the title, and the basic concept becomes surprisingly bold. An isolated child uses observation, technology, and engineering to defend his home from professional criminals. That is not a bad premise. In fact, it is a fascinating evolution of the original fantasy. Kevin proved that a child could survive alone. Alex proves that a child could understand the environment better than the adults around him. The fantasy has changed from independence to competence. And that distinction is bigger than it looks. There is something universally satisfying about watching an underdog defeat an overwhelming force through intelligence. It does not matter whether the underdog is 8 years old or 80. We enjoy seeing power challenged by creativity. That is why the best moments of Home Alone 3 still work. The audience sees the trap. The villain walks toward it. We know what is coming. And for a second, the movie asks us to forget every criticism and simply enjoy the oldest form of physical comedy imaginable. Someone is about to make a terrible mistake. In that sense, Home Alone 3 remains deeply connected to the tradition that made the franchise famous. It may have lost Kevin. It may have lost the original musical warmth. It may have traded a pair of lovable burglars for international mercenaries chasing a military microchip. But it never completely loses the fundamental joy of watching a child turn the ordinary world into something extraordinary. And maybe that is the fairest way to remember it. Not as the sequel that failed to replace Home Alone. Not as the forgotten masterpiece that everyone was supposedly wrong about. But as a solid, inventive 1990s comedy trapped inside one of the most recognizable titles in family film history. Its greatest mistake was not making the wrong movie. Its greatest mistake was asking audiences to forget the movie they already loved. And yet, decades later, that distance has finally created an opportunity the film never had in 1997. We can watch Home Alone 3 without waiting for Kevin to walk through the door. We can judge Alex on his own terms. We can appreciate the traps for what they are. We can laugh at the absurdity of professional criminals being defeated by an 8-year-old with a remote-controlled car. And we can recognize the strange charm of a movie that sits at the exact moment when 1990s Hollywood was leaving behind practical childhood fantasies and moving toward a more technological, franchise-driven kind of blockbuster entertainment. Maybe that is why the movie has survived. Not because it was the sequel everyone wanted, but because somewhere underneath the dated gadgets, exaggerated villains, frozen floors, mechanical traps, and unmistakably 1997 atmosphere, it still contains the same fantasy that made the original impossible to forget. Give a child an empty house, a dangerous problem, and enough imagination, and suddenly the entire world belongs to him. And if you grew up discovering Home Alone 3 on a snowy afternoon, on cable, on VHS, or during one of those endless holiday movie marathons, that version of the movie may always belong to you in a way no critic score ever could. So perhaps the real question is no longer whether Home Alone 3 deserved to carry the name. Perhaps it is whether, after all these years, we can finally let it be its own movie.